the story of the world's worst aviation disaster has been told and retold thousands of times. By the handful of lucky survivors, by the firefighters who rushed into the fog unaware of the magnitude of the disaster, by the investigators who pieced together the catastrophe, by journalists and writers tasked with informing the world of what had happened, and by sociologists and behavioral scientists who sought to understand why humans make mistakes. The precision and nuances of these accounts may vary, but the central theme remains the same. Wrong decisions, the unfairness of coincidence, and the randomness of fate. March 27, 1977. John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York, USA. It's 45 minutes past midnight, and Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bob Bragg, and Flight Engineer George Warnes are inside a Pan American Airways 747-100, preparing for a charter flight to the Canary Islands. Their majestic two-deck Boeing 747, named Clipper Victor, welcomes 380 passengers. Many of them retired couples embarking on a sightseeing tour to the Canary Islands, along with 16 crew members. For the pilots, this flight is entirely routine. Undoubtedly, there had been many flights like this over their long careers, allowing the three men to accumulate more than 47,000 flight hours. Pan Am Flight 1736 would soon take off from New York. Its first and only stop, having started in Los Angeles before continuing to its final destination, initially set for Gran Canaria. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, the crew of a KLM Royal Dutch Airlines Boeing 747-200 was also preparing for a flight to the Canary Islands. Captain Jacob Louis Veldhuisen van Zanten was a living legend at KLM, the face of the airline's advertising campaign and the head of its Boeing 747 training program. He spent most of his time training new pilots, and this flight to Gran Canaria would be his first regular line flight in 12 weeks. His first officer, Klaas Meurs, was not a novice, but he had recently been promoted to the 747, having accumulated only 95 hours since earning his type rating, granted by Captain Van Zanten himself. Lastly, flight engineer Willem Schroeder was the most experienced of the three, with more than 17,000 flight hours. He was also the president and co-founder of the European Flight Engineers Organization, a major international union. Along with this prestigious crew, 11 flight attendants and 235 passengers were on board KLM Flight 4805, totaling 246 people, most of whom were Dutch families heading to the Canary Islands for a holiday of sun and surf, courtesy of the tour operator Holland International. The destination for both Pan Am Flight 1736 and KLM Flight 4805 was Gran Canaria Airport, located in the city of Las Palmas on the island of Gran Canaria. At the time, it was the largest airport in the Canary Islands and the primary entry point for tourists arriving from abroad. However, this also made it a target for those unhappy with the governance of the islands. A political party advocating for the independence of the archipelago took advantage of Spain's instability following Franco's death to promote an armed wing known as the Fuerzas Armadas Guanches, FAG, with the declared aim of achieving self-rule for the Canary Islands through terrorism. Although the group never directly killed anyone during its brief history, it would become infamous for setting off a chain of events that far exceeded its political and terrorist ambitions. At 12:30 p.m., the Fuerzas Armadas Guanches detonated a bomb inside a florist shop in the terminal of Gran Canaria Airport, injuring the shopkeeper. As police rushed to respond to the attack, the airport received a phone call warning of a second bomb, prompting authorities to close the airport and evacuate the terminal. In the air, the crews of the Pan Am and KLM 747s received the unfortunate news that their destination airport was closed until further notice. They were told that all traffic would be diverted to the nearby island of Tenerife. Pan Am's crew protested, stating they had enough fuel to hold over Gran Canaria for several hours. But without a clear timeline for the airport's reopening, the controller could not grant their request. The island of Tenerife had only a small single runway airport called Los Rodeos. While it had handled international traffic before, it certainly wasn't equipped to accommodate Boeing 747s. The airport lacked radar, a runway visibility measuring system, proper signage on the taxiways, and its centerline lights were out of service. To make matters worse, it was a Sunday, and the control tower was understaffed. KLM Flight 4805 was one of the first to arrive, landing at 1:38 p.m. Anticipating more arrivals, controllers instructed it to stop at the end of the main taxiway. The KLM crew allowed its 235 passengers to disembark into the terminal, where they were given special identification cards so they could be found again at the end of the stopover. Meanwhile, more planes quickly lined up behind them, including Pan Am Flight 1736, which arrived at 2:15 p.m. At 2:30 p.m., just 15 minutes after the Pan Am 747 landed at Los Rodeos, police completed their inspection of Gran Canaria Airport. Having found no second bomb, the airport was swiftly reopened. Upon receiving the good news, Pan Am's crew requested clearance to start their engines and head for the runway for takeoff, as several smaller planes had already done. However, the controller informed them that they probably couldn't pass KLM 747, which was still parked at the end of the taxiway. First Officer Bob Bragg and Flight Engineer George Warren stepped out of the Pan Am aircraft to check if they could maneuver around the KLM 747. But returned discouraged. They would have to wait until KLM moved. Meanwhile, the KLM crew struggled to gather all their passengers, a task that proved extraordinarily difficult and wasn't completed until 4:00 p.m., an hour and a half after Gran Canaria had reopened. Aboard the Pan Am plane, tensions were rising as flight attendants struggled to tend to passengers, most of whom had boarded in Los Angeles the night before and had now consumed every last bit of food and drink on the 747. Frustrated by their inability to depart until KLM cleared the taxiway, Pan Am's crew expressed their dissatisfaction to the KLM pilots, but there was little anyone could do to speed things up. In the end, KLM's cabin crew failed to reassemble all 235 passengers. One passenger, Robina van Lanschot, a Dutch tour guide living in Tenerife, took the opportunity to leave the airport and head home without notifying anyone. Meanwhile, KLM's captain, Jacob van Zanten, made another calculated decision that would further delay their departure from Tenerife. Once all the passengers were back on board, he decided to refuel with an additional 55,500 liters of fuel, enough not only to fly to Gran Canaria, but also to return to Amsterdam. Throughout the afternoon, the weather at Los Rodeos had been steadily deteriorating. By the time KLM Flight 4805 began refueling, clouds already blanketed the airport, creating intermittent low visibility conditions. Both crews were acutely aware that if visibility dropped below takeoff minimums, they would be stranded in Tenerife overnight. Finally, at 4:51 p.m., KLM finished refueling and requested clearance to taxi. Pan Am made the same request just 20 seconds later. After completing final checks, KLM's 747 headed toward the runway. Due to the prevailing westerly winds, both planes would have to take off from runway 30, the same runway they were using for taxiing but in the opposite direction. This meant they would have to taxi to the far end of the runway before turning around, a complex process made more challenging by the reduced visibility and the large number of aircraft still parked on various taxiways. Four minutes later, the controller cleared Pan Am 747 to follow KLM down the runway and then turn off at the third exit to free up the runway for KLM's takeoff. Captain Grubbs expressed dissatisfaction with taxiing on the runway before KLM had taken off, but chose not to push the issue with a controller whose command of English seemed less than fluent. As the two 747s slowly moved down the runway in the thick fog, the controller and both crews lost sight of each other. With no ground radar at the airport, the controller had to rely on the pilot's reports to track the two planes' positions. For the pilots, figuring out exactly where they were and where they were headed was easier said than done. Visibility fluctuated rapidly between 100 and 900 meters, and the taxiways weren't marked with any signs or painted numbers. To make matters worse, the Spanish controller's thick accent made it difficult for the Pan Am crew to understand what he was saying. When the controller instructed them to exit the runway, the third one on your left, the pilots spent the next 2 minutes trying to figure out if he had said first or third. KLM 4805, how many exits have you passed already?
I think we just passed the fourth.
Alright, that's the last one. Now, at the end of the runway, make a 180-degree turn and report back for clearance. Meanwhile, the Pan Am cockpit was still unsure whether they should take the third exit. Can you confirm that you said the third exit? Yes, the third. 1, 2, 3, the third. While the Pan Am crew reviewed the taxi checklist, the KLM 747 reached the end of the runway and began its delicate 180-degree turn. Captain Van Santen had to concentrate intensely because the 747 needed 42 meters to make the turn, and the runway was only 46 meters wide. The Pan Am crew, still taxiing down the runway, struggled to find the third taxiway exit. According to their charts, the third exit was a narrow turn sharply back in the direction they had come from, requiring 2 successive 148-degree turns to enter the taxiway that would lead them to the parallel taxiway.
That's the second one.
For the next minute, the crew focused entirely on the fog-covered runway, trying to spot the third exit.
And this would be the third, right?
It can't be. There's no way we can make that turn.
Maybe when he said the third, he was counting from where we were. We'd already passed the first.
Given that a 747 couldn't make the third exit, the crew wondered if the controller had started counting from their current position when he gave the instruction, meaning they should take the fourth and final exit, which was much easier for a 747 to navigate. No one was sure. Onboard KLM Flight 4805, the crew had completed their final checklist for takeoff, and First Officer Muirs declared the checklist complete. Visibility at that moment was 900 meters, but another dense cloud was fast approaching the runway at a speed of around 6 meters per second. With the minimum visibility for takeoff being 300 meters, they knew they had to begin rolling before the cloud enveloped them. At that point, Captain Van Zanten started moving the throttle levers forward, but First Officer Muir said, "Wait a minute, we don't have ATC clearance."
Yes, I know. Ask for clearance.
KLM 4805, ready for takeoff, awaiting clearance.
KLM 4805, you are cleared to the Papa Beacon. Climb and maintain flight level 90, right turn after takeoff, continue heading 040 to intercept the 325 radial from Las Palmas VOR. First Officer Muir began reading back the controller's clearance. "Roger, sir. We're cleared to the Papa Beacon, flight level 90. But at that moment, Captain Van Zanten pushed the throttles forward for takeoff and announced, "We're going." Taken completely by surprise, First Officer Muirs hurriedly finished his transmission. "Turn right heading 040 to intercept the 325. We're now taking off." The controller thought Muirs meant they were in takeoff position and responded with, "Okay," then paused. After 2 seconds, he continued, "Stand by for takeoff. I'll call you." Message that no one would hear. The communications were being conducted on the same frequency for both KLM and Pan Am. Pan Am's First Officer Bragg, believing that the controller's pause indicated the end of the transmission, pressed his microphone and said, "And we're still taxiing down the runway. Clipper 1736. This terrible coincidence caused the transmissions to overlap, resulting in interference that manifested in the KLM cockpit as a loud squeal, partially drowning out the controller's words. This interference prevented the KLM crew from hearing the second part of the controller's message. "Stand by for takeoff, I'll call you," as well as the Pan Am crew's message that they were still taxiing on the runway. Meanwhile, Pan Am 747 continued exchanging messages with the controller, which KLM could hear. Pan Am 1736, report when you've cleared the runway.
Roger. We'll report when clear.
At that moment, in the KLM cockpit, the flight engineer asked, "The runway isn't clear then?" The KLM 747 continued accelerating. The first officer called out V1, the decision speed. After this point, aborting the takeoff was impossible. At that moment, Pan Am Captain Victor Grubb saw the lights of the KLM 747 barreling out of the fog at full speed. "There he is, look at him," he shouted. "God damn, that son of a bitch is coming straight at us!" Grubbs yanked the rudder hard to the left and pushed the engines to full throttle, desperately trying to steer his plane into the grass. In the KLM cockpit, the Pan Am 747 suddenly appeared out of the fog as a massive white object directly in front of them. "Oh shit," Captain Van Zanten exclaimed. pulling the control column back as hard as he could in a desperate attempt to take off. The tail began scraping along the runway, creating a shower of sparks as the fully loaded 747 with its engines at maximum struggled to lift off. At the last moment, the wheels left the ground and the plane staggered into the air. It looked like they might make it. But it was too late. KLM Flight 4805, with its nose lifted and its tail just 2 meters above the ground, crashed into the side of Pan Am Flight 1736 at a speed of 260 kilometers per hour. The four engines, landing gear, and rear fuselage of the KLM plane sliced through the right side of the Pan Am plane, killing hundreds instantly. The collision between the two jumbos lasted only a fraction of a second, and then KLM Flight 4805 continued flying for a few more moments. 150 meters further down the runway, it crashed into the ground and broke into 3 pieces. The fuel ignited, and the wreckage slid another 300 meters down the runway, engulfed in flames. No one on board the KLM 747 survived the explosion caused by the fuel. Meanwhile, on the Pan Am 747, some people managed to jump from holes in the fuselage onto the wings. One of its engines fell to the ground and exploded instantly, killing several people who had survived the initial impact. The Pan Am pilots, still alive, couldn't escape the cockpit and threw themselves through a hole into the cargo area, from where they were able to escape the inferno. In the control tower, the thick fog prevented controllers from seeing the wreckage or the fire. But the sound of 2 explosions was unmistakable. With the recent bombing in Gran Canaria still fresh in their minds, the controllers' first thought was that terrorists had attacked again. A pilot from a plane parked on the tarmac soon reported seeing fire through the fog, but its location and origin were unclear. It wasn't until the controllers tried contacting both 747s and received no response that they realized something truly horrible had happened. The rescue of the survivors was chaotic but swift. The 5 ambulances that had arrived at the airport quickly filled up, and several people were transported to the hospital in private cars. A radio call went out asking for more vehicles, but by the time people started arriving at the airport, all the survivors had already been evacuated. Unfortunately, far fewer had survived than rescuers had hoped. Of the 248 people aboard KLM Flight 4805, none survived. Investigators would later conclude that the impact itself wasn't particularly violent, but that the fire consumed the plane so quickly that almost no one was able to even stand up from their seats, let alone open an exit door. On Pan Am Flight 1736, where fire was also the primary cause of death, the loss of life was even greater. Initially, it was reported that 327 of the 396 people on board had died, but the figure soon rose to 335 as several victims with severe burns succumbed to their injuries. In the end, only 61 people survived, including all of the Pan Am pilots. The final death toll stood at 583. What had happened? How could a catastrophe of this magnitude occur at an airport? When investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States gathered on the island of Tenerife, they were confronted with the aviation industry's worst nightmare: the fatal collision of 2 heavily loaded jumbo jets. The chain of events left the investigators speechless. Neither plane was supposed to be in Tenerife. Both had been diverted there after the closure of Gran Canaria. Then the way the KLM plane was parked prevented the Pan Am 747 from passing by, even though Pan Am was ready to depart much earlier. Efforts to locate all KLM passengers and refuel the plane delayed the departure of both aircraft until after the fog rolled in, severely limiting visibility and forcing all parties to rely solely on radio communications to coordinate their movements. Then came a long series of misunderstandings, The Pan Am crew, convinced they wouldn't be instructed to enter a taxiway too narrow for a 747, missed their designated exit while trying to reach the next one. Meanwhile, the KLM captain, apparently mishearing a clearance, began his takeoff without permission. Two simultaneous warnings that could have revealed his mistake cancelled each other out, meaning neither was heard. The central question of the investigation was why KLM Captain Jacob Van Zanten initiated takeoff without clearance. He was one of KLM's most respected pilots, the head of the airline's Boeing 747 training program, a man so revered that when the airline first learned of the accident, they attempted to recruit him to lead the investigation, not realizing he had perished. The issue with Van Zanten was that for the past decade, he had primarily flown training flights, performing only the minimum number of actual flights needed to maintain his certification. He hadn't flown a regular scheduled flight in 12 weeks prior to the accident. Ultimately, investigators reached unanimous agreement on the following key conclusions. KLM's captain initiated takeoff without the essential clearance from air traffic control, ATC. The KLM captain did not abort the takeoff, even though Pan Am had reported that they were still on the runway. The KLM captain seemed unclear about the situation. After completing the backtracking maneuver, a 180 degrees turn to position for takeoff, he applied thrust without ATC authorization. The first officer told him, "Wait, we don't have ATC clearance yet." The captain then stopped the plane and said, "Yes, I know, asked for it." Pan Am continued taxiing to exit C4 instead of taking C3, as instructed by the control tower. As a result of the accident, several changes were made to international regulations. From that point on, all control towers and pilots were required to use standardized English phrases, and automatic fog navigation systems began to be installed on aircraft. Cockpit procedures were also changed, emphasizing joint decision-making among crew members. Specifically, the use of the word takeoff was strictly prohibited in any context other than during the actual takeoff. Instead, the word departure was to be used. Ground radars, which were not present at airports outside of major cities like London, New York, or Paris, began to be installed in most airports, although they wouldn't become widespread until the early 1980s. Their absence at other airfields would remain a contributing factor in future aviation disasters.